history looping through your throat. Cold machines, warm ghosts, we're humming under power lines. Your soft, sad, laughing notes get carried through the tangled wires. Cold machines, warm ghosts.
Hi, this is Joel. Welcome to the Taproot Therapy Collective podcast, and this is part one of Psychology Itself on the Couch, Psychohistory of American Psychology. What psychology sees through American history, what it refuses to see, and why its relationship to what it can and can't let itself see changes over time. There is a peculiar problem with eyes. They can see everything in the world except themselves. You can look at your hand, you can examine the texture of your skin, the lines on your palm, the way the light catches the fine hairs on your knuckles. But you try and see your own eyes and the actual organs doing the seeing, and you encounter a fundamental impossibility. You can only look at reflection. You can only study photograph. But the thing that does the looking cannot look while itself is looking. Psychology is America's eye. It's the apparatus through which we have learned to see ourselves. It provides the vocabulary that we use to describe our suffering. It supplies the categories that we use to sort our experience, and it generates the explanations that we need for when we try to understand why we feel the way we feel. For over a century, psychology has been the lens through which Americans have interpreted their inner life, and that is precisely why we cannot see it. We cannot see psychology because we are always looking through it. Every time we try to examine it, we use the very concepts that it gives us. We inherit their limitations. When we critique the DSM using diagnostic thinking, we question therapy using therapeutic language. We deconstruct with the language of deconstruction. We analyze the mental health system using its own framework. And the apparatus of examination is what's doing the examining. This isn't really a metaphor, even. This is this defining epistemological trap of modern American consciousness. Consider when you feel depressed, you probably describe it using words like symptoms and episodes. And when you struggle with anxiety, you might wonder about your triggers or your attachment style. When relationships fail, you reach for concepts like boundaries or trauma response or cognitive distortion, and these words feel natural. We don't know how to talk about ourselves without them. They feel accurate in describing reality, but they're not neutral observations. They're inheritance of specific historical choices made by specific people in specific circumstances. Choices that easily could have gone differently, hinge points that could have gone in a multitude of different directions across history, and they still carry assumptions about the nature of human suffering that we've entirely forgotten to question. Psychology is America's blind spot not because we ignore it, but we're obsessed with it. It is a blind spot because we have so thoroughly internalized its categories that we can no longer perceive them as categories at all. We experience them as reality itself. This series is an attempt to step outside of that trap, not by rejecting psychology, that would be impossible and foolish, but by understanding how it came to be, and by tracing the historical forces that shape its assumptions today, by examining the question that it was designed to answer and the questions that it was designed to make invisible. Because here is the terrifying truth. Every American psychology has faced a crisis. Every time the data has screamed that its assumptions were wrong, the profession has not responded by questioning those assumptions, but by doubling down on them. And we have built an entire system of psychological care on the foundations that even its architects knew were shaky, sometimes when they intended it to be. And we've done so because the alternative, actually confronting what psychology replaced and why, would require us to look at parts of the American project that we have spent a century learning not to see. Psychology did not emerge to fill a natural void. It emerged to fill a void that was being actively created by forces much larger than itself, and it still is. And it has spent the last 100 years trying to provide answers to questions that were never really about the mind at all. And this is how the story happened. Part 1, The World Before the Lens. To understand what psychology replaced, you have to understand what Americans used before psychology to make sense of their suffering.
When I first come to this country, I viewed it all around me, saw was right alone, and me a poor stranger and a long way from home.
But what was it? What did they use to make sense of the world before psychology? What did they use to make sense of their suffering? The answer is almost everything else. In 1890, the average American lived in a world with explanatory systems. If you felt despair, you might understand it as a spiritual trial or a dark night of the soul that would ultimately deepen your faith, something given to you for a reason. Even something meaningless was given meaning. If you felt rage, you might channel it through your ethnic community's traditions of grievance and solidarity. If you felt lost, you might locate yourself within your family's multi-generational story, your place in a chain of ancestors and descendants that gave your individual life cosmic significance. And that is if you were not brought here as an enslaved person who had no knowledge of where they came from and little memory of your family. If you felt exploited, you might understand that exploitation through the collective language of your trade union, your working class neighborhood, your fraternal organization. These were not primitive systems that psychology improved on. They were sophisticated, time-tested mechanisms, counterbalancing mechanisms for transforming raw suffering into meaning. And they shared one crucial characteristic. They were communal. They located the individual within a web of relationships, obligations, and shared narrative that extended far beyond the boundaries of just the person. The church told you that your suffering was not random. It was part of a divine plan that connected you to every other suffering soul across time. The ethnic enclave told you that your struggles were the struggles of your people, inherited from ancestors and bequeathed to descendants. And the Union Hall told you that your exhaustion and your poverty were not personal failures, but collective conditions that demanded collective solutions. Even in the saloon, the place that was this sort of maligned cultural institution, it provided this space where men could process grief and rage and anger in the company of others who understood, in a language that was allowed. And what all these systems had in common was that they pointed outward. They directed attention towards the social fabric, the community, or the shared condition. And when something went wrong in your life, the first question was not, what is wrong with me, but what is happening to us? This nostalgia, these systems were able to handle a tremendous amount of cruelty that the world was very good at dishing out. And they enforced rigid conformity, but they also punished deviation. They trapped people in roles that they never chose. The church could be authoritarian. The ethnic community could have an expectation or a set of conditioning that was not fair. But what mattered was that when these structures broke down, when immigration severed the connection to the old world, when industrialization destroyed the craft traditions, when urbanization scattered the extended family, something had to fill that void, and humans cannot live without explanatory systems. We cannot endure, suffering that means nothing. And when the old framework crumbled, Americans did not simply become more rational, more scientific, more free, not even more religious. They became desperate for new ways to make sense of their life. Psychology did not create this crisis, but it did inherit it. To understand how the psychological metaphors of this era were changing, you have to understand that Americans were learning to think about energy differently. By the late 19th century, energy meant steam. The locomotive had transformed the landscape, and the steam engine powered the factories. Thermodynamics, the science of heat, energy, and their transformation, was the master science of the era, explaining everything from the sun to the steam whistle. And when Americans began to think about the human mind, they reached for the metaphors that surrounded them. The mind was an engine. Emotions were pressures that built up and needed release. Repression was a boiler with a stuck valve. Neurosis was what happened when the pressure exceeded the system's capacity to contain it. This was not merely a manner of speaking. Sigmund Freud, who trained as a neurologist in an era when the nervous system was understood through hydraulic analogies, linked them to what he thought Americans were repressing, the sexuality that was not allowed during his Victorian morality-coded time. And he built his entire theoretical edifice on the language of pressure and discharge. The id contained primitive energies that demanded release. The ego managed these pressures, channeling them into acceptable outlets. Repression dammed the flow, but the pressure remained. And seeking any crack through which it could escape, it could make someone explode, enrage, or become psychotic and leaky. Blowing off steam was not just a phrase. It was a theory of psychological health. And American psychology absorbed these metaphors because they made intuitive sense to a society obsessed with building literal engines that powered everything. The human being was a thermodynamic system. Mental illness was an engineering problem. Treatment meant adjusting the valves, releasing the pressures, and restoring the proper flow. And this was an improvement over some of the earlier frameworks, but it was certainly more scientific sounding than demonic possession or moral weakness. And it carried with it assumptions that would shape American psychology for generations. The human being was a machine. The mind operated according to mechanical laws, and the goal of treatment was to restore normal functioning, to get the engine running smoothly again, which meant that someone had to understand each part of that engine. They had to have a name. What this framework could not accommodate was the possibility that the engine was not really designed for the tracks that we were asking it to run on, and that the pressures were building up, maybe not because the engine was malfunctioning, but because we were trying to run a train on a street instead of train tracks. The machine was working. The world is what had broken.
Back. Section 5, more speed, 4-7. Relief man passing. Relief man passing.
Before the 1880s, Americans lived in local time. Each town set clocks by the sun. When it was noon in Boston, it was not noon in New York or Philadelphia. And this did not matter when the fastest thing moving was a horse. The railroad changed all that. A train traveling from New York to Chicago crossed dozens of local time zones, and schedules became impossible. Accidents occurred when engines sat on the track, operated by different clocks, and in 1883, the railroads imposed standardized time zones on the entire continent. Local time was abolished, and the sun was dethroned. The clock became the master, and this seemed like a technical adjustment, but it was a revolution in the way that we made conscious experience. For all of human history, people had lived by natural rhythm. You woke with the sun, you worked while there was light, and the season shaped your labor. Your body knew when to be alert and when to rest because your body had evolved over millions of years in synchrony with the turning of the earth. And industrial time was different. The factory whistle blew at 6 a.m., whether the sun was up or not, no matter what time of year it was. And the shift ended when the clock said it ended, not when the body said it was tired. The assembly line moved at its own pace, and the worker adapted or was replaced, and time became a resource to be optimized, measured in minutes and seconds, and then bought and sold like any other commodity. And this reorganization of time required a radical redesign of our interior psychological space. The architecture of the early 20th century factory was explicitly engineered to facilitate total control over the production process, resulting in some of the first large-scale sensory deprivation and sensory overload experiments in American history. In 1930, the Austin Company designed the first entirely windowless factory for the Siemens Saw and Steel Company in Massachusetts. By sealing the perimeter, the factory plunged workers into fully artificial lighting, severing their connection to the outside world, the weather, and the natural passage of the day. Inside, the environment was dominated by deafening mechanical roars, relentless assembly line speed, and this created a paradoxical psychological state: simultaneous sensory deprivation from the lack of nature and sensory overload from the machines. The factory was a physical cage that required a complete rewiring of the nervous system to survive, and the psychological consequences were profound. Rural Americans whose ancestors had worked by the sun for generations were being asked to reprogram their nervous system for machine time. The bodies that showed up in the factories were not designed for this. They became fatigued, distracted, accident-prone. They resisted, and sometimes consciously. Psychology entered this space as a technology of adaptation. Its task was not to question whether the machine time was appropriate for human beings. Its task was to help human beings adjust to machine time. And the brass instruments in the psychology laboratories measured reaction times, attention spans, fatigue curves, all the variables that determined whether a worker could keep pace with a clock. Behaviorism, which would soon dominate American psychology, was not just an academic theory. It was a practical program for creating workers who could function in mechanical time. And if human beings were simply stimulus response machines, then their inconvenient inner lives, their fatigue and their boredom and their longing for natural rhythms and especially meaning, could be trained away. And the soul still remembered that the sun could overwrite this conditioning. And this was presented as science. It was also, whether its practitioners understood that or not, a service to the industrial order that was remaking American life. In 1893, the World's Fair Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago, and millions of Americans passed through these gleaming pavilions, marveling at the future that technology promised. And in the anthropology building, they encountered something strange: a psychology laboratory. The exposition featured gleaming brass instruments imported from the laboratories of one Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany, the man widely credited as the founder of experimental psychology. Visitors marveled at the hip chronoscope, which could measure reaction times in milliseconds. They examined the kymograph, which traced physiological responses on rotating drums. They peered at the aesthesiometric, a compass designed to map the sensitivity of human skin. The message was unmistakable. The human mind was no longer a mystery. It was an object, as immeasurable as a steam engine, as predictable as a chemical reaction. And the soul had been replaced by the nervous system. And the nervous system could be timed, graphed, and quantified. This was the moment when psychology announced itself to the American public, not as philosophy and not as speculation, but as science, hard science, instrument science, the kind of science that built bridges and powered factories. It was an audacious claim, and Wilhelm Wundt himself, back in his hometown, was far more cautious about what instruments could actually measure. But he understood that the brass chronoscopes captured only the thinnest surface of mental life, reaction time, sensory thresholds, and the basic mechanics of perception. The deeper questions of consciousness, meaning, and human purpose remained untouched, but American psychology was in a hurry. It needed legitimacy, it needed funding, and it needed to prove that it belonged alongside physics and chemistry in the university, not regulated to the philosophy department where aging scholars debated unanswerable questions since ancient Greece. And so it embraced the instruments, the measurements, the appearance of precision, even when that precision captured only a little bit of what actually mattered about the human mind. And this was the first instance of a pattern that would repeat throughout American psychological history: the adoption of a scientific aesthetic as a substitute for scientific substance. The brass instruments looked like science, and they felt like science. They generated numbers that could be published in journals, but they could not answer the question of what actually tormented Americans in 1893. Why do I feel so lost? Why has the world betrayed me? Why is the world of my parents gone? Why did my parents not prepare me for this one? How do I make sense of a life that no longer follows the old rules? And for those questions, Americans would need a different kind of psychological entity entirely.
From such humble beginnings grew the astonishing modern world in which we now live. We cannot conquer the mountains, but our railroads now run through them with ease. We cannot defeat the river, but we can bend it to our will and dam it for our own purposes. We now live in a time of endless possibility. More has been learned about the treatment of the human body in the last 5 years than was learned in the previous 500. 20 years ago, 39 was the number of years a man could expect from his life. Today it is more than 47. Eventually the train tunnels will crumble. The dams will be overrun. Our patients' hearts will all stop their beating. But we humans can get in a few good licks in battle before we surrender.
William James should have been the defining figure of American psychology. He had every advantage: a Harvard professorship, a brilliant writing style, a philosophical range that encompassed everything from religion to neuroscience. His 1890 masterwork, The Principles of Psychology, remains one of the most readable and human texts that the discipline ever produced. But James' vision of psychology was fundamentally incompatible with what America was becoming. James believed that consciousness was a stream, coining the phrase stream of consciousness, continuous, flowing, ever-changing, impossible to chop into discrete, measurable units. More radically, James developed what he called radical empiricism, a philosophical position that insisted that the connections and meanings between things were just as real as the things themselves, even if they couldn't be measured. Fundamentally anti-scientific, because in science, if you can't measure it and no instruments are available to quantify it, then it can't be real. Traditional science dealt with objects that could be isolated and measured, and James argued that human experience was constituted precisely by the relationships that connected those objects. You could not understand a person by breaking them into components any more than you could understand a melody by analyzing individual notes. James's psychology was expansive. It included religious experience. It took seriously the testimony of mystics about consciousness and phenomenological states, transcendent states. It investigated mediums, telepathy, not because James was incredulous, but because he believed science had no right to prematurely close any account of reality. He wanted a field that was fundamentally open in a way that a purely objective, scientific, and quantifiable field cannot be. He was willing to sit with uncertainty, to hold open questions rather than forcing premature closure. And this is exactly why he could not be followed. America in 1900 was not interested in uncertainty. It was not interested in the flowing, ungraspable nature of consciousness, and it was not interested in anything other than a rigid system of control. It was interested in prediction. It was interested in taking the chaos of human behavior and rendering it manageable to fit into the society that it was building and the project that it was making. James's colleague, James McKeen Cattell, who had studied under Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, publicly attacked James. Cattell viewed psychology as a tool for generating applicable data that could be used in industry, government, to sort people, to select workers, to identify fit and unfit. And James' spiritualist tendencies, his openness to the unmeasurable, threatened that entire project. Cattell wrote to James that his investigations into psychical research were doing much to injure psychology. In the pages of the Journal of Science, Cattell warned his peers that they could not follow James into the quagmires of subjectivity. The reaction of William James was not a scientific necessity, it was a structural imperative. And American institutions were beginning to demand a psychology that could deliver quantifiable results, test scores, efficiency metrics, sorting mechanisms. James's psychology of the stream, of radical connection, of irreducible meaning, simply could not be made to serve those purposes. This was a similar fallout that would happen between Freud and Jung on another continent, as we discussed in the Weird History of Psychotherapy series that we released on this podcast earlier. And it's because of all of these reasons that the father of American psychology was effectively orphaned by his own discipline. His influence would persist underground, resurfacing decades later in humanistic psychology and certain strands of phenomenology, and then later would be interesting to some of the newer neuroscientists who have theories that consciousness is caused by quantum phenomena, like Penrose and others, Maria Strome. However, mainstream American psychology was flowing in a very different direction.
By the big clock. An average guy with a family and a job he liked, with everything turned upside down by the strange things that happened in 36 hours. A grim, relentless search that could lead to only one man. Myself.
To understand the psychology that America actually got, you have to understand Frederick Winslow Taylor. Taylor was not a psychologist, he was a mechanical engineer, but his vision of what a human being should be would shape American psychology more profoundly than any laboratory experiment. In the late 1890s, Taylor looked at the American factory and saw chaos. Skilled workers still retained significant control over their own laboratory. They set their own pace, and they used their own methods. They shared craft knowledge with each other. And to Taylor, this was intolerable efficiency. He proposed a radical solution: strip workers of all decision-making authority, all craft, all meaning in their work. Using a stopwatch, managers would study every moment, break time down into its simplest components, and then dictate the one best way to perform each task. Workers would no longer think, they would execute, and the mind would be separate from the body, and the body would be optimized like any other machine. Taylor's most famous experiment involved putting a pig iron handler named Henry Knoll, whom Taylor called Schmidt in his writings, into an experiment to increase Schmidt's daily load from 12.5 tons to 47 tons, nearly quadrupling his output. But Taylor's description of the ideal worker for this task reveals the soul of his philosophy. He writes, "One of the very first requirements for a man who is fit to handle pig iron as a regular occupation is that he shall be so stupid and so phlegmatic that he may nearly resemble in his mental makeup the ox or any other type." This was not a throwaway comment. This was the foundation of his entire worldview. Taylor genuinely believed that the ideal worker should have as little inner life as possible. Consciousness was a bug, not a feature, and the mind got in the way of the body's efficiency to do work for other people to take its labor. Taylor's scientific management spread rapidly through American industry. By the 1910s, it had become the dominant paradigm for organizing work. What it created was an enormous problem that Taylor himself never solved. How do you get human beings who inconveniently do have inner lives to behave as though they don't? This is where Taylor's project would intersect with American psychology. Psychology would become not a force for liberation, but as a technology for closing the gap between what Taylor needed workers to be and what workers actually were: human beings.
Back in Detroit, Henry Ford wondered how he could bring the price of the Model T down to where everybody could buy it. He figured that the more cars he made and sold, the cheaper he could sell each one. And he went to work on this idea. In those days, each car was built from the frame up on stationary wooden horses. But the battle against wasted time and wasted effort was being won. The cars began coming off the assembly line at the rate of one every 40 seconds. And what Henry Ford had foreseen happened. Mass production and the assembly line drove the price of the Model T down from $800.
Where Taylor had provided the theory, Henry Ford provided the implementation and the most sophisticated psychological intervention in the industrial age. In 1914, Ford announced his famous $5 a day wage, more than double the standard industrial rate. It sounded like corporate benevolence, but it was actually the most ambitious program of psychological engineering that America had yet seen. To qualify for the $5 wage, workers had to prove that they were living properly. Ford created the sociological department, 200 investigators who showed up unannounced at workers' homes. They checked whether the house was clean. They asked whether the worker drank alcohol or gambled. They examined bank accounts to ensure workers were saving properly. They probed into marital relations. They inspected children's school attendance. If investigators found a worker's life undesirable, then that worker was placed on probation. And if they didn't reform within 6 months, they were fired. But this sociological department had a deeper purpose than moral surveillance. Ford's factories employed massive numbers of recent immigrants, men who spoke different languages, followed different customs, and retained loyalties to communities and traditions that Ford needed to dissolve. The Ford English School was Ford's answer. Immigrant workers were required to attend classes where they learned not just the English language, but the English language as Ford defined it. The first sentence that they learned was, "I am a good American." The graduation ceremony tells you everything that you need to know. Workers dressed in the traditional garments of their homelands would march onto a stage and descend into an enormous prop labeled the American Melting Pot. Teachers would stir the pot with 10-foot ladles, and minutes later, the workers would emerge from the pot dressed in identical American business suits, waving identical American flags. The symbolism was not subtle, and the immigrant's history, his community, his inner life, were the impurities to be burned away in the metaphor of the kiln. What remained was the standardized unit of production. Ford was not a psychologist, but he understood something that psychologists of his era were only beginning to theorize. Human behavior could be engineered, not only predicted, but changed. The inner life could be shaped. Give me control of a man's wages, his housing, his family, his language, and his social world, and I can make him into whatever I need him to be. What Ford lacked was a scientific justification. He was operating on an intuition and a brute force economic model, but American psychology was about to provide the theory that he needed.
Cash rules everything around me. Cream, get the money. Dollar, dollar bill, yo. Yeah.
Each of these eras of psychological attack, the changing of the conception of psychology, and also Americans changing their systems of agency, conceptions of consciousness, and inner worlds are usually accompanied by conspiracy theory. To understand the conspiracy theory that was taking root in the American psyche, you have to understand the profound visceral dislocation of this age. As the 20th century was dawning, Americans felt an invisible hand tightening around their throat, and the world of their parents was gone. Local time had been abolished. The sun had been dethroned by the railroad clock, and the autonomy of the craftsman was being systematically eradicated by the assembly line. People felt a sudden and terrifying loss of control over their own labor, their own time, and their own communities, all during a period where the objective metrics of the time were telling them that they were financially more successful, that their labor was worth more. And when human beings experience systemic trauma, they don't have the vocabulary to explain the unconscious. They project that anxiety onto monsters, and the monsters that they chose were the robber baron. The public became obsessed with this idea that there was a shadowy cabal of financial elites, men like J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs, and they were secretly controlling the world from smoke-filled rooms. And this paranoia culminated in the infamous 1910 meeting at Jekyll Island, an exclusive resort off the coast of Georgia, where a handful of the world's most powerful bankers gathered under the cover of darkness to draft what would become the Federal Reserve Act. By this point, the average American was experiencing a terrifying invisible squeeze. Periodic and devastating financial panics, like the Panic of 1893 and the Panic of 1907, would suddenly sweep across the country, wiping out entire communities, bankrupting independent farmers, and then foreclosing homes. And the belief took hold that these crashes were not natural market corrections, but engineered catastrophes. The conspiracy theory posited that a money trust was deliberately orchestrating these economic booms and busts. The public believed that through a secretive web of interlocking corporate directorates, this Eastern elite would completely control the railroads, the steel mills, the flow of credit, the systematic choking of the agrarian and working class masses to consolidate absolute power. This wasn't just a fringe delusion passed around in underground pamphlets. The mechanics of this conspiracy theory were massive and mainstream. Muckraking journalists published an explosive expose detailing J.P. Morgan's financial octopus, and accompanied with political cartoon. Popular politicians like William Jennings Bryan built entire presidential campaigns railing against the cross of gold and the Eastern bankers. So the Silverbugs said that this was an oppressive internal standard of money that was putting on this rural agrarian group by some sort of centralized force. The U.S. government was even forced to launch the Pujo Commission in 1912, formally investigating the existence of this financial leviathan on this national stage. Believers in the conspiracy theory were validated with terrifying proof in November of 1910. 6 men, representing roughly a quarter of the world's entire wealth, boarded a train in New Jersey under fake names, and they traveled in total secrecy to an exclusive, isolated resort off the coast of Georgia, Jekyll Island. And there, in a smoke-filled room, hidden from public view, they drafted the blueprint for the central banking system that would become the Federal Reserve. While the conspiracy theorists were mostly wrong in the mechanics of the money trust conspiracy, there was a structural reality in the Gilded Age of capitalism that they were largely correct about. By focusing all of their terror on the bankers, Americans completely missed the actual psychological heist. The real conspiracy theory was infinitely deeper and far more devastating than anything discussed in a private club on Jekyll Island. The bankers were only centralizing money. The engineers were centralizing the mind. The true conspiracy was Taylorism. It was the systematic, overt theft of human inner life and agency. People felt that they were being turned into machines because functionally and economically they were. But the conspiracy to strip the average American of their soul wasn't hatched in a secret vault. It was walking right out in the open, clipboard in hand, being timed to a fraction of a second with a stopwatch on the factory floor. Everyone was participating in it. And while Americans were looking for a monstrous system that was being turned on somewhere in the external world, what they were feeling was actually a system on the interior of the self that was being desensitized, dissociated, and turned off. One that would have monstrous consequences for the future of American psychology.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior. I was surprised, even no, I was dismayed to find out that I could really be that I could act in a manner so, and while I was doing it, this was a part of me I hadn't really noticed before.
In 1913, a 35-year-old psychologist named John B. Watson delivered a lecture at Columbia University that would transform American psychology forever. It became known as the Behaviorist Manifesto. Watson looked at the philosophical debates over consciousness, the careful distinctions between sensation and perception, the elaborate theories of introspection, and the endless argumentation about the nature of the mind, and he declared them all irrelevant. Psychology, as the behaviorist views it, Watson announced, is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Note the phrase prediction and control, not understanding, not healing, not describing, not even finding causation. The purpose of psychology was to predict what humans would do and control when humans did it. Everything else was mystical speculation unworthy of science. In one stroke, Watson declared the stream of consciousness to be scientifically irrelevant. William James's flowing, meaningful, irreducible subjective experience off the table. The soul, the self, the inner depths that the philosophers had contemplated for millennia, all eliminated and removed from the American project. What remained was a human being as a biological machine, an input and output device that could be programmed by manipulating its environment. There was no need to understand what people felt or thought. You only needed to know what stimuli produced the correct response. If humans were simply stimulus and response machines, then Taylor's stopwatch was the appropriate tool to study them. And if consciousness was irrelevant, then Ford's melting pot was a simply effective form of conditioning. If behavior could be predicted and controlled, then the skilled worker's troublesome autonomy was not a right to be respected, but a variable to be managed. And behaviorism was not imposed on American psychology by evil conspirators. It was succeeded because it fit. And it answered the questions that American institutions were asking. It provided a framework that made the emerging industrial order feel not just economically efficient, but scientifically inevitable. And that is perhaps the cruelest irony. Watson genuinely believed that he was being progressive. In an era dominated by racism and eugenics, which argued that immigrants and minorities were genetically inferior, Watson's environmentalism suggested that anyone could be molded into a productive citizen. It was the birth of a neoliberal order, or what would become one. And at the same time that the mind was being saved from racists by the creation of a system that would allow anybody to change given the right stimuli, the same new instruments that were being used to study psychology were also being used to rewire it. The telegraph had already accomplished something unprecedented. It separated information from transport. For all of prior human history, a message could only travel as fast as a human body could carry it. But the telegraph annihilated this constraint. News from across the continent arrived within minutes. The stock ticker brought Wall Street into offices everywhere, and time itself was standardized, not for philosophical reasons, but because the railroads needed coordinated schedules and the telegraph made coordination possible. This was not merely a convenience, it was the reorganization of consciousness. First the sun, then the clock, and now the beginning of the network. In the old world, information was generally tied to context where it could be acted upon. You learned about events in your community, your trade, your family, context where the information could guide decision and response. The telegraph flooded Americans with information from everywhere, most of which they could do nothing about. The newspaper became a catalog of distant events. fascinating and disturbing and utterly disconnected from the reader's capacity to respond. It was a flood of information, and the result was a new kind of consciousness, informed but impotent, stimulated but also passive, aware of more than any previous generation and with less agency than any generation before them. This was the consciousness that psychology would be asked to explain and manage, a nervous system that now extended across continents, not just families and small communities, all overwhelmed by inputs that it could not process, seeking frameworks to make sense of a world that no longer cohered. The motion picture added another dimension. By 1910, Americans were gathering in darkened theaters to watch flickering images of people who were not really there, in places that they had never been, doing things that they could never do, or maybe would never do, a heightened form of spectacle and experience that went beyond paintings and print magazines. This was not storytelling as humanity had always known it, embodied, present, and communal. This was something new, a mass dream projected onto a screen, experienced simultaneously by millions, creating shared references and shared desires that no organic origin in the community had created. William James, still writing in the last years of the 19th century, had insisted that consciousness was a stream, continuous, flowing, and unified. But that stream was being broken into disconnected pools, each reflecting a different facet of an increasingly incoherent world. Psychology emerged in this environment not as a neutral science of the mind, but as one technology among others, competing with the telegraph, the telephone, and cinema to try and define what American self could become. In 1920, Watson's academic career came to an end. He was forced to resign from the Johns Hopkins University after his affair with a graduate student became public. What happened next tells you everything about the real purpose of behaviorist psychology. Exiled from academia, Watson did not disappear. He joined the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency, one of the largest in the world, and within 2 years he'd become vice president. He had realized that the same principles he used to study laboratory rats could be used to study and manipulate consumers. And before Watson, advertising was largely informational. It told you the virtues of a product, its price, its quality, its utility. Watson understood that human beings are not rational actors who evaluate products logically. He believed in an unconscious that previous advertisers had not, and they are biological machines responding to stimuli based on these unconscious processes. He had no interest in understanding them, but he did have interest in manipulating them. To sell products, you don't appeal to reason, you trigger reflexes. While Taylorism controlled the worker's body during production, Ford's sociological department controlled the worker's social environment, and now Watson's advertising controlled the worker's desires, ensuring that wages earned on the assembly line would flow back into the consumption of mass-produced goods. The loop was closed. The human being, once embedded in communities of meaning, once possessed of craft knowledge and spiritual depth, once a citizen with the power to shape collective destiny, had been reconceptualized as a node in an economic circuit. Stimulus in, response out, labor in, consumption out. Watson himself was remarkably explicit about what he had accomplished. In 1924, he published his famous boast: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." Human agency had been erased, not by religious dogma, but by tyranny, by science, or at least the aesthetics of science. Looking back at the trajectory of American psychology from 1892 to the 1920s, the sheer scale of the transformation becomes terrifyingly clear. In 3 decades, psychology had been enlisted to help solve a problem that it did not name: how to make human beings compatible with machines. The steam engine had provided the metaphor: pressure, release, thermodynamic regulation. The telegraph and cinema had begun the rewiring: fragmented attention, information without action. And behaviorism had provided the theory: humans as input and output devices. William James offered a vision of a humanity that was radical, pluralistic, and deeply connected to the profound mysteries of consciousness and experience. Also, a self-evidencing principle that was internal, a subjective space that the behaviorists had no interest in. James saw the individual as an active, meaning-making agent in complex and interconnected nodes, where the spaces between the nodes were important. But this vision was fundamentally incompatible with a society transitioning to mass industrialization. The factory floor did not need meaning. It needed compliance, and the system did not need souls, it needed hands. The ghosts of the 1920s still heavily haunt our present reality. The digital algorithms that carefully curate your social media feeds, the biometric surveillance that monitors modern warehouses, and all of the people who work inside them. These are all direct descendants of Watson's manifesto and Taylor's stopwatch. They are the refined, hyper-normalized iteration of a system explicitly designed to bypass our consciousness, erase our agency, and hijack our reflexes. And we see this today in the modern strategy of nonlinear warfare, pioneered by Vladislav Surkov in Putin's Russia, one of his propaganda directors. The goal of this modern psychological warfare is not to sell a single lie, but to make the environment so loud, so filled with contradictory noise, that nothing feels real. This deliberate flooding of the mind introduces a state of learned helplessness, the exact psychological state that the behaviorists and the industrial engineers of the 1920s realized was necessary to manage a mass population. We live in a world built on the foundational premise that the human soul is an obsolete variable, a glitch in the machine that was successfully patched out over a century ago on the factory floor of the American mind.
Cold machines, warm ghosts. We're humming under power lines. Your soft, sad, laughing notes get carried through the tangled wires. Cold machines, warm ghosts. You sang and something in me breaks. I'm holding on to every word, like proof that we were not mistakes.
Thank you for listening to part 1. Please check out the website, gettherapybirmingham.com, for more free blog articles and resources. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast, either in your favorite podcast library as an audio or for YouTube as a video.